Before the ink dried on the Declaration of Independence, America was already a place of contradictions. Liberty proclaimed in words, yet denied in practice to millions. Hello, welcome back to our final chapter of the three-part series of the wild truth behind America's beginning. It was the summer of 1776, and in Philadelphia, a group of men gathered in a sweltering hall to do something audacious: break away from the most powerful empire on earth. They weren't entirely sure it would work, but they knew that if they failed, they'd hang for treason. Outside the walls of Independence Hall, the streets buzzed with rumors and anxiety. Some colonists cheered the idea of freedom. Others whispered about chaos, war, and economic ruin. Loyalists, still tied to the crown, warned that rebellion was a fool's errand. And somewhere across the Atlantic, King George III probably thought this little uprising would be crushed before winter. But the colonies had something the British didn't: sheer stubbornness. Farmers, shopkeepers, printers, and sailors were now soldiers, untrained, poorly supplied, often barefoot, but relentless. They were led by George Washington, a man who had more experience losing battles than winning them, yet somehow knew how to keep an army alive long enough to keep fighting. The Revolutionary War was messy, brutal, and far from the romanticized paintings of elegant generals on horseback. This was a war of freezing winters, spoiled rations, and muskets that misfired more often than they hit. Yet, victory came in 1783, when Britain finally admitted the United States was no longer just a rebellious colony. It was a sovereign nation. But here's the twist: independence didn't mean unity. 13 states now stared at each other, unsure how to actually run a country. They had no king, no real central government, and no clear plan for what came next. It was like throwing a bunch of roommates together, handing them a blank lease, and saying, "Figure it out." The first attempt, the Articles of Confederation, was, let's just say, a polite disaster. States acted more like mini-countries than a united nation. Congress couldn't collect taxes, couldn't regulate trade, and often couldn't even muster the funds to pay soldiers. It was a system that worked great if you loved local control, but fell apart when the country needed to act as one. By the mid-1780s, it was obvious: if the United States didn't strengthen its foundation, it might not survive its teenage years as a nation. And so, in 1787, leaders gathered once again in Philadelphia. This time, not to declare independence, but to reinvent the very idea of what America could be. What emerged was the U.S. Constitution, a blueprint that blended bold ideals with messy compromises, and set the stage for both the greatness and the struggles to come. And while the ink was still fresh, one question loomed: could a nation built on freedom survive the weight of its own contradictions? When George Washington took the oath as the first president of the United States in 1789, the air was thick with both hope and uncertainty. The war was over, the Constitution was ratified, but now came the hard part: turning paper promises into a functioning reality. Washington wasn't interested in being a king, but people treated him like one anyway. He walked a careful line, setting precedents for everything, from how to address the president, "No, Your Majesty, thank you," to how to peacefully hand over power. But underneath the formality, the country was a fragile experiment. The national debt was staggering, the economy inconsistent, and the new federal government still had to convince states and citizens to trust it. Enter Alexander Hamilton, the Treasury Secretary, with a vision and a knack for stirring trouble. Hamilton wanted a strong central government, a national bank, and economic policies that tied the states together under one financial roof. Not everyone agreed. Thomas Jefferson, champion of the agrarian ideal, saw Hamilton's plan as a path toward monarchy and corruption. The two clashed so fiercely that they unintentionally gave birth to America's first political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The founders hadn't planned for political parties, but like most things in early America, They emerged whether people wanted them or not. Meanwhile, out west, settlers were moving into territories beyond the Appalachian Mountains, sparking conflicts with native nations who had never agreed to surrender their lands. Treaties were signed, promises were broken, and violence flared. The young United States was already repeating a pattern that would define much of its future: expansion at the expense of those who stood in the way. Foreign policy brought its own headaches. The French Revolution exploded across the Atlantic. And while some Americans celebrated it as a sister revolution, others feared its chaos. Britain still occupied forts in the Northwest Territory and harassed American ships at sea. Washington's policy was simple: stay neutral and avoid getting dragged into another war. By the time Washington stepped down in 1797, he had kept the country together, but he also left behind warnings against political factions, foreign entanglements, and letting regional differences tear the nation apart. The trouble was, his warnings were about to be ignored almost immediately. After Washington retired to Mount Vernon, the presidency passed to John Adams, and almost immediately, the fragile unity of the young republic began to fray. Adams, a Federalist, inherited a political climate that was already boiling. The French Revolution had gone from hopeful to horrifying. And now France and Britain were both dragging America into their messy fight over who ruled the seas. American ships were seized. Diplomats were insulted in what became the infamous XYZ affair. And while some shouted for war, Adams knew the new nation couldn't afford it. Instead, he pushed for peace. But his reluctance only deepened the political divide. The Federalists accused Jefferson's faction of being too cozy with the French, while Jefferson's Democratic Republicans painted the Federalists as wannabe monarchs. The bitterness turned ugly with the Alien and Sedition Acts, laws that made it harder for immigrants to become citizens and easier for the government to punish critics. These acts were meant to protect national security, but in practice, they were used to silence opposition. The backlash was so fierce that it paved the way for Thomas Jefferson to win the presidency in 1800, in what historians call the Revolution of 1800. The first peaceful transfer of power between rival parties in U.S. history. Jefferson wasted no time reshaping America's vision. He shrank the military, cut taxes, and famously purchased the Louisiana Territory from France in 1803 for $15 million, doubling the size of the country overnight. It was, as he put it, an empire of liberty, though native nations already living there might have disagreed, to explore the new lands. Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark on their legendary expedition. Accompanied by Sacagawea, a Shoshone woman who proved essential to their success. Their journey wasn't just about maps. It was about staking a claim before other powers could. But expansion brought fresh tensions. Every new territory sparked the same burning question: would it allow slavery? The answer would shape politics, economics, and the moral fault lines of the nation. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 tried to keep the balance between free and slave states. But everyone knew it was a temporary fix. Meanwhile, in the shadows of this growth, Andrew Jackson, a rising political star, embodied a new populist style of politics that appealed to the common man while devastating native nations through policies like the Indian Removal Act. America's westward push was becoming unstoppable. And with every step, the stakes grew higher. A house divided, a nation remade. By the mid-1800s, the United States was no longer a fragile experiment. It was a restless giant. Railroads crisscrossed the landscape, factories roared, cities grew at breakneck speed, and waves of immigrants poured in. But beneath the promise of progress lay a wound that refused to heal: slavery. For decades, politicians had tried to patch over the divide between North and South with compromises, balancing free and slave states like a precarious seesaw. But the more America expanded west, the harder it became to keep the peace. Every new territory reignited the same explosive question: would slavery spread, or would it be stopped? The tension turned into bloodshed in places like Bleeding, Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers literally fought in the streets. Then, in 1857, the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision declared that African Americans, free or enslaved, could never be citizens, a ruling that inflamed the abolitionist cause and pushed the nation closer to the brink. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, the South saw it as a direct threat to their way of life. One by one, states seceded, forming the Confederate States of America. The following year, shots were fired at Fort Sumter, and the Civil War began. The war was brutal, lasting for long years and costing more than 600,000 lives. It was just a battle over territory. It was a fight over the very definition of America. Would it remain a divided collection of states with competing systems, or would it become a single unified nation where all men are created equal? Was more than just ink on paper. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 reframed the war as a fight against slavery, giving it a moral force that resonated beyond U.S. borders. By 1865, the Union emerged victorious. Slavery was abolished, and the Confederacy lay in ruins. But victory didn't mean harmony. The Reconstruction era brought new freedoms for formerly enslaved people, and fierce backlash from those determined to maintain white supremacy. Still, the Civil War had transformed America. It had proven that the United States could survive its deepest crisis, even if the scars would last for generations. The country was now poised to industrialize, expand, and eventually step onto the global stage as a superpower. And so, from 13 rebellious colonies to a sprawling nation of states, America's story became one of reinvention, a country constantly wrestling with its ideals, its contradictions, and its future. The question that remains, even now, is the same one the founders faced in 1787. Can a nation built on the promise of liberty truly live up to it? Thank you for watching this 3-part series on Leevano Chronicles. If you enjoyed this journey through America's untold history, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because history doesn't have to be boring. And the next story might just surprise you.